The main structures that we're really interested in are tendons and ligaments. These are connective tissue, and they have separate properties. So Cody, tell us about tendons.
The 4 rules for tendons are that tendons usually connect muscle to bone. Okay, we have the exception right here of our lateral extensor tendon as it inserts into our main extensor tendon. The other rule is that they are inelastic. Now, not completely inelastic, they do have some elasticity to them. With that, they are for movement. With it being attached to a muscle, the only thing a muscle can do is contract. So as it contracts, it's going to pull on that cable, which is going to cause the movement of that limb. The last thing is whenever it contracts, it's going to glide, that tendon is going to glide through a sheath called a synovial sheath.
Excellent. And with ligaments, there's 3 main characteristics of a ligament. Ligaments are elastic. Some are different. We talked about the annular ligaments. The annular ligaments are inelastic, but for the most part, ligaments are elastic. Ligaments connect bone to bone. Again, lots of exceptions. There's 10 of them that we want to learn on here. So we have 10 exceptions we're going to be talking about. And then finally, their job is support. So if you want to have an analogy for a horse's leg, you can think of it like a puppet. So the bones would be the pieces of the puppet. The ligaments would be the part that holds the puppet together. The tendons would be the puppet string that causes the puppet to move. And the muscles would be the puppeteer. That's not a bad analogy since there's not movement muscles below the near hock.
On the palmar aspect of the front leg, we're going to have 2 tendons that we're going to talk about. We're going to have our superficial flexor tendon. Tendons originate from the muscles they're named at. It's going to originate at superficial flexor muscle. The superficial flexor muscle is going to originate from the distal humerus. It's going to continue course distad from the muscle, and it is going to form a ring around the deep flexor tendon called the manica flexora. From there, it is going to bifurcate distal to the sesamoids and insert collaterally into distal P1 and proximal P2, collaterally being both sides of. Now, the deep flexor tendon is going to originate from the deep flexor muscle. The deep flexor muscle is going to originate from the distal end of the humerus and the ulna. It will course distad, and it will insert into the semilunar crest of the coffin bone. We have 2 tendons on the dorsal aspect of our front limb. The first one we're going to talk about is the main extensor tendon, also known as the common extensor tendon. You're going to hear pretty commonly the word digital add into it, and that just means that it's going to end in the digit. So the common or main extensor tendon originates the main extensor muscle, which originates at distal end of the humerus. It will course distad, and the insertions are going to be the same as it is on the pelvic limb. It's going to insert into proximal P1, proximal P2, and the extensor process of P3. The lateral extensor tendon is going to originate from the lateral extensor muscle. The lateral extensor muscle is going to originate from the proximal end of the radius. This will course distad, and it is set different than in the hind limb. Instead of inserting in the main extensor tendon, it is going to insert into proximal P1. We have 2 tendons on the plantar aspect of the hind limb. We have our superficial flexor tendon originate from the superficial flexor muscle. Our superficial flexor muscle is going to originate from the distal end of our femur. It will course distad from the distal end of the superficial flexor muscle, and it will insert collaterally on our calcaneus. Now, this is a really cool insertion, and the reason that it's a cool insertion is because I kind of had an understanding that it was more like this calcaneal tendon where it inserted into the top of this calcanean process. But the truth of the matter is it has a reticular attachment, and it attaches both sides of it. The purpose of this attachment isn't necessarily to attach to that calcaneus as much as it is to keep that superficial flexor tendon riding over the top of this ridge. So it holds it from both sides to keep it from falling off one way or another. It then will continue to course distad, and just proximal to the sesamoid is going to form a ring called the manica flexora around the deep flexor tendon. Just distal of the fetlock joint, it's going to bifurcate, insert collaterally into distal P1 and proximal P2, collaterally meaning both sides of. I'm going to take a second and we're going to start reflecting these annular ligaments so that we can see that attachment.
Since the annular ligaments have very little elasticity to them, that's what allows them to really give you strength. So you have annular ligaments around your elbow, and that means whenever you bend your elbow to pick up something, those annular ligaments are keeping those tendons against the elbow, giving you strength. If they were to be stretchy, then you would just basically be pulling the annular ligament away from your elbow. Now, Cody mentioned that the superficial flexor tendon bifurcates below the fetlock, so when it divides into 2, it'll go down to the pastern joint.
So as you can see here, here's our manica flexora. It forms that ring around the deep flexor tendon, and it's going to keep those tendons together as it passes over the top of our sesamoids. I'm going to go ahead and take a second, and I'm going to pull that back from one direction, and now we can see that little area of our manica flexora. As we follow this superficial flexor tendon down past our manica flexora, you can see the striations of the bifurcation. Where it inserts collaterally on both sides of, I went ahead and cut the medial aspect of it, and the view that you're seeing here is that superficial flexor tendon pulled out to the lateral side. Okay? Underneath that lies our deep flexor tendon. Our deep flexor tendon originates at our deep flexor muscle. Our deep flexor muscle is going to originate at the proximal end of our tibia and our fibula. It is then going to course distad from the muscle, and it's going to insert into the semilunar crest of our coffin bone. So the semilunar crest of our coffin bone is going to be this area right here. Okay? So we can go ahead and we can start pulling that back. It is going to pass over our navicular bone, and when it passes over that, there's going to be a bursa sac called a prototrochlear bursa or navicular bursa that lies there.
Biomechanically, on the pelvic limb, we have something called the reciprocal apparatus, and it basically means when one joint flexes, they all flex, and the only way to extend the joint would be also to extend one joint would be to extend the other joint. The best way to think about it would be a cable bolted to your armpit, bolted to your elbow, bolted to the palm of your hand, and if you bent your elbow, you would also bend your wrist. So on the hind limb, you can see it happening here. And this is one that has had a lot of the objects of the reciprocal apparatus already taken off of it. So it's amazing how well that's still working. But the important thing for a horseshoer is you cannot look at a foot in a weight-bearing position whenever you're working on the bottom of it, because the act of picking it up off the ground folds it around the fetlock, and the distal end of the cannon bone is rarely square with the axis of the cannon bone, meaning that what you're seeing here is a misrepresentation of true medial lateral balance. So on our deep flexor tendon, I was always confused, and I would do a dissection, and I talk about our subtarsal check ligament. The subtarsal check ligament on this particular model has already been resected away, but I would find this little tissue all the time on these pelvic limbs, and I'd be, well, I don't know what that is, but if I pull it, I can see that it's pulling on a muscle up here. Thanks to Dr. Matt Durham out there at Steinbeck Equine, he informed me that's actually just another deep flexor muscle head. So we have the traditional origins that we all know about at proximal tibia and fibula, but there's an additional muscle that helps feed the deep flexor tendon. And whenever you find that below the hock in your dissection, that is still deep flexor muscle and deep flexor tendon, a contributing tendon. The subtarsal check ligament would have gone from your tarsus into your deep flexor tendon, and it's very thin, and it's already been resected off of this deep flexor tendon.
On the dorsal aspect of the hind limb, we have two tendons. We have our main extensor tendon, also known as the long extensor tendon, originating at the main extensor muscle, which originates at the distal end of the femur. It will course distad from the distal end of the muscle, and it will insert into proximal P1, proximal P2, and the extensor process at P3. The extensor process at P3 is going to be this little triangular point that sticks up. Also with that, we have our lateral extensor tendon, originate from the lateral extensor muscle. The lateral extensor muscle originates from the proximal end of the tibia. Now, the really cool thing about the lateral extensor tendon on the pelvic limb is it is actually an exception of the muscle to bone rule. And it's going to course distad, and it is going to insert into our main extensor tendon about a third of the way down the cannon bone. And you can see the lateral extension here, and this is our main extensor tendon here. Okay?
Whenever we talk about ligaments, there's 27 that I want you guys to memorize: origin, insertion, and function. So if you put them into bite-sized pieces, that makes things a little bit easier. Whenever you get the textbook, you'll see that the very first category we talk about are exceptions of the bone-to-bone rule. Now, there's 10 of them. If you just memorize and learn those 10 of them today, heck, you're over 1/3 of the way towards getting 27. So anyway, the ligament of the ergot, we don't always spend a lot of time finding it. But the ergot is a thickened skin area, and sometimes it grows a piece of horn, especially on draft horses, or a lot of times on ponies. You'll actually have horn growing out of this like a chestnut. And the ligament of the ergot attaches to the skin and courses dorsodistad, and it usually inserts into the distal annular ligament. It doesn't always, but it usually does, and it looks like a piece of nerve tissue. If you look at that pretty carefully, you can see it looks a lot like nerve. Your check ligaments. Check ligaments do what their name would imply. So if you look at my superficial flexor tendon, the superior check ligament is this one, and that's called the radial check ligament. This being the radius, that being the origin, inserts the superficial flexor. Again, exception to the bone-to-bone rule. My deep flexor tendon also has one. The deep flexor tendon has a large check ligament. It's called inferior, but it's actually the subcarpal check ligament originates the distal end of the carpus, coursing distad, and inserts to the deep flexor tendon. Both of these ligaments keep the tendons in check whenever the tendon is being used. So it's almost like a dampening system for that tendon so they don't get overstressed. On the thoracic or on the pelvic limb, we also have a check ligament on the deep flexor called the subtarsal check ligament. We do not have one on the superficial flexor, and the reason for that is the superficial flexor tendon is inserted in the calcaneum process, as you may remember, and because of that insertion, we don't need a check ligament on the superficial flexor tendon of the pelvic limb. So there's 4 of our exceptions to the bone-to-bone rule. The next one is the suspensory ligament. So Cody's been doing a little bit of knife work while I've been talking here. The suspensory ligament is also known as the interosseous muscle or interosseous tendon. And you can see here it originates at the in this case, the plantar proximal cannon, but it could be palmar proximal cannon. There will be adhesions to the distal row of carpals or tarsals. Don't get too excited about that. They're there. It courses distad and bifurcates at the nodule and the splint bones. So the nodule and the splint bones is like an icicle that's had a drop come down and then freeze again. It's like a little ball at the end of your splint bones. So where that nodule is, that's where your bifurcation occurs. It then inserts to both of the sesamoid bones. So after that bifurcation, it inserts there, and a smaller branch courses dorsodistad into the main extensor tendon. Now, just check that out. So there's my main extensor tendon, and where this came, coursing dorsodistad, my main extensor started getting wide. So you can imagine the suspensory branches of the extensor tendon just pulling that extensor tendon wide right there. Okay? So there's 5 of our exceptions. The next 4 are going to be chondro ligaments. The word chondro is the root word for cartilage. So the collateral cartilages are off the wings of the coffin bone, and here is a collateral cartilage. You can see how this material flexes right there. So that's a cartilaginous tissue that's coming off the wings of the coffin bone. My chondrocompedal is the collateral ligament that connects that to distal P1. So it's right under there. Okay, that's my chondrocompedal. My chondrocornal is not well defined on any of these because we don't usually find it, but it courses dorsad and inserts to P2. My chondrotendinous will come all the way and attach to my main extensor tendon, and my chondroungular attaches the collateral cartilages. So the collateral cartilages come off of here, connects the collateral cartilages to P3. Those are your 4 chondro ligaments. And then finally, we have our transverse laminae, also known as the T ligament. Transverse laminae is often not found during dissection, but as we reflected back, this is my deep flexor tendon, and you can see as you pull this forward, that tissue that is attached to P2, right there, that is the transverse laminae, also known as the T ligament. So it's separating the deep flexor tendon sheath from the podotrochlear bursa. You can see that area there is the podotrochlear bursa as the deep flexor tendon is about to pass over the navicular bone. All right, so there's our 10 exceptions to the bone-to-bone rule. How about doing some sesamoidian ligaments for us?
Sounds good. The next group of ligaments that we're going to talk about is sesamoidian ligaments. There are 6 sesamoidian ligaments that we're going to talk about. The first one I'm going to talk about is the intersesamoidian ligament. It horizontally joins our sesamoids. Now the view that we have here is a view of the plantar aspect, or palmar if this was a front limb, of the hind limb with the deep and the superficial flexor tendon resected. Okay? On the sides, both sides of collaterally, we're going to have collateral sesamoidian ligaments, and they're going to collaterally hold the sesamoids in place to the metatarsal or metacarpal phalangeal joint. Now they're going to set just underneath the suspensory ligament. Right here, we're going to have 2 more ligaments. Now these 2 ligaments, the first one we're going to talk about is the superficial or straight sesamoidian ligament, also known as the Y. It is going to originate from the distal end of our proximal sesamoid. It is going to course distad and insert into proximal P2. Just to the sides of it, our V, or middle sesamoidian or oblique sesamoidian ligament, is going to originate distal end of our proximal sesamoids, course distad and insert into distal P1. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to cut through the suspensory ligament. Now the suspensory ligament is always really impressive how much force it takes. So as he pulls there, you can see how much tension that is. So I'm going to go ahead and cut that suspensory ligament, and it's going to be really impressive how this whole thing drops. So that suspensory ligament really holds a lot of force. I'm going to cut through our collateral sesamoidean ligaments, the collateral ligaments of this metatarsal phalangeal joint. And this is going to be our best view to be able to see our deep or cruciate sesamoidean ligament and our short sesamoidean ligament. What's happened is we've pulled this joint back and drained the synovial fluid on it. And you can see on this side I haven't done anything to the joint, but this side I went ahead and just removed some of this material, and I left with a little bit more definition here. So if you look right here, you can see the short sesamoidean ligament, and it's going to hold the sesamoids to proximal P1. It's going to be a real short little ligament. Now if you look right here, you can see the striation starting to happen right there, and that is our deep or cruciate sesamoidean ligament. They're going to cross over each other, and it's going to hold the sesamoids also to the proximal end of the P1.
Excellent. Now, a quick note, this is all articular cartilage, distal of the cannon bone. That is the dorsal aspect of the sesamoids. So if you orient yourself to that anatomically, you can imagine how that all came together. And that's proximal P1 right there.
I'm going to talk about 3 ligaments right now, and they're going to be your annular ligaments. Now, annular ligaments are a little bit different than the common 3 rules that we have for ligaments in the way that they are not as elastic. They're a fairly rigid ligament. And the purpose of an annular ligament is it's what holds the tendons and anything against the body. So if you think about it, if you see how this is flexed, how all these tendons are being held against this, that is the job of the annular ligaments. Now the first one we're going to talk about is our palmar or plantar annular ligament. In this case, because we're on the hind limb, it is going to be our plantar annular ligament. And we can see it right here, and you can see how it horizontally connects across that metacarpal or metatarsal phalangeal joint, and it's holding all of this together. And you can see it comes here, that's all of it. Now just distally of that, we have our proximal digital annular ligament. Now the confusion there might be is how can that be proximal even though it's distal of our plantar annular ligament? And that is because of the word digital. That we are talking about everything in the digit, which is from the proximal end of P1 distally. Okay? And as you can see it looks like a cowhide. And here it is here, and this is our proximal digital annular ligament. Now we're going to move to this other limb. Whenever I did that dissection, the last one we're going to talk about is our distal digital annular ligament. And to really show off all of the proximal digital annular ligament, I had to remove it. So as you can see here, we have a really good view of our distal digital annular ligament sitting underneath our forceps there.
So we have done the 10 exceptions to the bone-to-bone rule. We've done the 6 sesamoideans. We've done the annular ligaments. So we still have navicular ligaments, pastern ligaments, and the category of ligaments that are not in a category. So the pastern ligaments, I feel that the pastern ligaments and navicular ligaments might be better to draw. Our next 2 ligaments are going to be our navicular ligaments. So we have our suspensory navicular ligament. Cody has resected this to show the branch of it right here. You can see it on the model of Wally's buddy right there. So it's this tissue coming from distal P1 down to the navicular bone. And if we draw it, you just want a lateral view for that. And basically that tissue would be here.
So it's going to originate at distal border of P1. It's going to course distad and insert collaterally onto your navicular bone.
Now, I always thought of this like a swing set. And I used to think it went around the whole top of the navicular bone. But in reality, it kind of inserts like this. And this area here is considered scutum. So that would be our suspensory navicular ligament would be here along the edges of the navicular bone. The next one is our impar ligament, also known as the distal navicular. And it is on the dorsal edge of the navicular bone. And you can kind of see it. If the foot was extended, you'd be able to see it better. But it's going to join the navicular bone to the area just palmar, in this case plantar, to the semilunar crest of the coffin bone. So we'll draw P1 and P2. This is a palmar view or plantar view. And the two pair of passenger ligaments, there's going to be a pair right here. Those are known as axial because they're closer to the axis on that particular structure. And then there's a pair right here, and that pair is known as abaxial. Now, kind of very similar to collateral ligaments. They're just short little binding ligaments that happen in those areas. Why don't you do the plantar ligament for us real quick, Cody?
So the plantar ligament is a really cool ligament to me. Anytime that you have an extreme amount of force pulling up, you need an equal amount of strength pulling down. So a good example of this is our sesamoidian ligaments. The way that they are all the straight and the oblique, they pull down on the sesamoids where the suspensory ligament will pull up on it. In this case, we have our calcaneal tendon. Well, the calcaneal tendon is a group of tendons made up of the semitendinous, the gastrocnemius, you've got your superficial flexor tendon, and you've got your soleus. So all make up this calcaneal tendon group that insert into the top of your calcaneal process. Now, this plantar ligament is going to originate at your calcaneal process, and it's going to course distat, and it's going to continue to have insertion all the way down your calcaneus, inserting into your fourth tarsal and your fourth metatarsal. You can see the striations of it all right here. So to give you an idea of how much strength and how big that ligament actually is, if you look right there with that fourth tarsal is, you can see that area of missing material that plantar ligament is filling in.
All of this.
All of that.
And also look at the roughened area. If you look at the roughened area on a bone, that's where you're going to have insertion of a tendon and ligament.
Perfect. The next ligament in the group is going to be your interosseous ligament. Your interosseous ligament is going to join your splint bones of your second and fourth metacarpal metatarsals to your third metacarpal metatarsal. So if we'll look here, it's a Velcro-like ligament that connects. It's really, really short. It's just a connecting ligament that connects these splint bones to our cannon bone, and it lies right in here. Now, it used to be kind of said that the average horse that would ossify by the time they're 6. I don't know that I find that true because most of the dissections of limbs that we boiled out, you'll find that that is not attached. My theory on that is by the time the horse is 6, they have had a splint, which is a tear of that interosseous ligament, and the osteoblasts have come in and built up the tissue attaching the splint bone to the cannon bone.
All right, so we have collateral ligaments next. And collateral ligaments are these short little binding ligaments that connect joint surfaces. So here is the collateral ligament of the fetlock joint. That would be the medial collateral ligament of the fetlock joint, lateral collateral ligament of the fetlock joint, medial collateral ligament of the passenger joint, lateral collateral ligament of the passenger joint, so on and so forth. So they're just short little binding ligaments on the sides of joints. And our last one is capsular ligaments. Why don't you do that?
So a capsular ligament does exactly what it says it do. It creates a capsule around a synovial joint. Now, you can't have a capsular ligament create a capsule that is only the size of that joint. Otherwise, as that joint flexed, it would break it or tear it. So as we can see here, we have cut into this joint. But if you look at this material here, that's setting right there and right there, that is a portion of the capsular ligament. The capsular ligament is going to be lined with a synovial membrane that produces your synovial fluid. Okay?
All right, so that is our tendons and ligaments. And now we're going to pull a foot off and talk about this incredible structure called the hoof.